Hello and welcome to
Arts and Entertainment with Chris and Randall.
I'm Chris,
I'm Randall.
and today we have our special guest, Bill. Say hi, Bill.
Hello.
And today's episode, we're going to do something really cool. So, I have noticed, gentlemen, that the 21st century has a very, very popular genre of film that has made a lot of money, garnered a lot of awards. There's been over 20 plus films on this genre, and it's very, very distinctive for this century. And if you guys were going to say superhero movies, you would be wrong. I'm talking about the other incredibly popular genre that is just all over for the last 22 years of American cinema and has done really well at the box office and has done really well at the award show. I'm talking about musical biopics. Specifically, I'm talking about musical biopics made in the 21st century about artists and musicians, bands, music people in the 20th. And today we've brought on Bill Gucwa, a resident film expert, writing expert, to offer his Hollywood analysis, as this is a very much a Hollywood genre. But before we start, as always, please like, share, subscribe, comment. And if you want to reach us, Randall, what's a good way to get to us?
Well, just go to our website, chrisandrandall.com, and you check out our Facebook page for Arts and Entertainment with Chris and Randall. And yeah, check it out. Leave a comment.
Right, we definitely want to hear what you think. Just a quick, I know there's a lot of movies. Again, as I said, almost 30 movies have come out on this topic. So we're not going to cover all 30 movies. We're just going to talk about the overall trends, and we're going to talk about 9 specific movies, each of our 3 favorite ones that we really feel like tell us a lot about the genre. But I think there's 2 questions I want to constantly go back to when we're looking at films and really thinking about this, which is why are these films about the 20th century made in the 21st century, these music biopics, why are they so popular? And the second question is, what are these films saying about the state of music, about history, about the time, our own shared history that we've already lived through? A quick explanation of what we mean by musical biopic. Bill, can you just give us like a brief history of the musical biopic in film?
Well, there's always been musical biopics. The first talkie was a jazz singer, but it really wasn't about the life of Al Jolson, but it was a musical in a sense. No, it was a fictitious story, but they made a movie of Night and Day with Cary Grant about
Cole Porter.
Cole Porter, yeah, that was made in the 1940s. But biopics in general have always been part of film history, always. But the musical, you're right, the musical biopic was kind of a subgenre, is kind of been, become a new, I don't want to use the word fad, but it is kind of more popular now than it's ever been.
Well, would you say, Bill, the jazz singer was like the first one?
I would say it was, for so many reasons, Al Jolson, it also being the first talkie, and it had music in it. It was sort of like the perfect storm, and it became, it was a hugely
But it was more of a musical. Hey, Bill, quick thing just for our viewers. I think you're on a leaning back chair. Don't lean back because you shake.
Okay.
You're already getting the mood for music, which I appreciate.
Yes.
But like, I guess what would be like the Glenn Miller story, and
with Jimmy Stewart, the Glenn Miller story,
and then Night and Day, which is the Cole Porter, the very whitewashed Cole Porter story, where he's a heterosexual man who loves a woman.
Right.
They did that? Amazing. I didn't know.
So no, but that, and actually there is a film called The Lovely, which was made in this century about Cole Porter, where they actually talk about that. But so I guess it starts out in the 40s, really, looking back on the great American songwriters of the 20s and 30s. And then prior to the beginning of the 21st century, are there any other really notable musical biopics that people might know about?
trying to think. There aren't many with popular music.
I'm thinking of like Coal Miner's Daughter, about Loretta Lynn.
That I forgot about that one. Yeah, Sissy Spacek. And
that was what, 1980.
I think she won the Academy Award.
Academy Award for.
Yeah, she won the Academy Award. Geez, I can't think of that many. Can you?
Well, so there's like Coal Miner's Daughter. There is there's Sweet Dreams about Patsy Cline with Jessica Lange. That also
and that was what, in the late 80s, early.
There was one about Elvis Presley. Russell. It didn't do very well.
That was a television movie. That wasn't theatrically released.
See, that's even worse.
There haven't been that many.
Well, in some ways, the phenomena of these musicians becoming so huge and like heroic, it's like a modern, more of a contemporary phenomenon, maybe.
Well, I think a lot to do with it is the music, and this is my opinion, and I do try to stay relevant. The music of today isn't as strong as the music of yesterday. So now people like making a musical about Queen or making a musical about Elton John. People I think are starving for good music.
I definitely want to get to that, but just while we're talking about the genesis, I would say things like, Purple Rain is kind of a loose autobiography of Prince. It's
Purple Rain
is loosely based on his real life. Purple Rain, which comes out in 1984, that's a super popular movie that's kind of about Prince's life, loosely based. You guys saw Purple Rain, right?
Yes, of course.
Yes.
And then I honestly think the thing that happens at the beginning of the 21st century, I think that, because I think no genre of film really starts without there being like some couple of films that come out in rapid succession that make it go, hey, this is more than a fluke. So I would say the three films, and we'll get to one of them in a little bit, the three films that come out very early in the first 5 years of the 21st century is 8 Mile, which is, again, kind of almost like Purple Rain, a very loose origin story of Eminem, directed by Curtis Hanson. Ray, 2004, about the life of Ray Charles, directed by Taylor Hackford. And then I Walk the Line, James Mangold's biography about Johnny Cash and June Carter Cash. And those three films do very well at the Oscars. They make a lot of money. They bring a lot of people who had not previously been fans. Weirdly enough, this is true. People who had not been fans of Eminem because they were too old started to like Eminem. People who were too young, who had not been fans of Ray Charles, came in to see about Ray. People who had kind of knew a little bit about Johnny Cash but didn't really understand the context of the music. And then all of a sudden, now all sorts of movies start really picking up speed, so that by the end of that first decade, you're almost averaging at least one film every year to 2 years, which, keep in context, like Iron Man. Okay, I think The Incredible Hulk in 2003 is the first Marvel film to come. There's the Spider-Mans, which are like, there's three of those, but as far as like Disney goes, it's like Hulk, then Iron Man. There was like maybe 6 superhero movies in the first decade of the 21st century. There was considerably more music biopics. So let's get to it now. So my first question, Bill, and I'm going to really lean on you as a writer, is would you say that the musical biopic is a melodramatic genre?
Mostly. It's mostly melodramatic, but it also, in fact, I would say, yeah, mostly it is. I'm trying to think of a comedy. There's comedy elements, obviously, but most of them are melodramatic. And that just...
and I don't mean that every film is formulaic, but just like action films, and all films have a formula. Mm-hmm. Is there almost like a certain kind of formula that most of the early musical biopics follow?
Well, usually the biopics that are made now usually follow the formula of regular biopics that have been made since the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. And it's usually a chronological told story, from the birth of the artist or the birth of the famous person to their death. And it's funny how the formula really hasn't changed. That's why some of them that don't follow the formula are now the ones that are pretty good. When I see musical biopics and they follow the old bio formula, those are the ones that I find to be a little bit more stale. But that's because I've seen every biopic ever made.
Right. So it seems to me like, I was just going to finish my thought. It feels like when you're doing a living artist, if they don't die, it's like, oh, look, they had a bout with drugs, or they had a bout with a bad relationship. Like, there's normally some, oh, what's love got to do with it? I totally forgot about that film.
Right.
But there's like some struggle, even if they live at the end, that they overcome. And normally, and tell me if I'm wrong, most of these films, not all, but many of these films end with a big musical number that's one of their classic hits. And now that when you hear that classic hit, it has a whole new context.
I just thought of a famous biopic, a musical biopic that was made in the 40s, Yankee Doodle Dandy, with James Cagney, and he won an Academy Award.
What's that a biopic of?
Of Cohen.
George M. Cohen.
Cohen, and he wrote the song Yankee Doodle Dandy, but he wrote how many musicals on Broadway. And again, that movie starts out with his actual birth, working in vaudeville, his struggles, how he became famous, and then when he became famous. And it even ends the movie with him visiting FDR in the White House, being honored. Musical biopics still use the template of biopics in general. That's why something like Rocket Man was a breath of fresh air, because it used fantasy sequences to tell the story or interpret the creative struggle of Elton John, instead of going chronologically, which they did anyway.
Right. It did pretty well. I mean, it's tough to make a movie about a living artist, but, and you brought this up, and Randall, I really want to bring you into this too, is that why do you guys think these movies do so well with the critics and the awards? Why do you think there's so many Academy Award nominations?
Well, Bill made a good point earlier that maybe part of this genre is driven by nostalgia. I mean, maybe that has something to do with it. I mean, I hadn't considered that before, but that makes a lot of sense. Nostalgia for music that doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely a good point, and I want to get to it in its own section, but just for the moment, is there something, guys, about watching a Jamie Foxx channel, a Ray Charles, or watching what's his name who played wow, I hate having these brain issues.
I'm sure there's a certain joy in seeing an actor attempt to embody somebody you've loved listening to for years and years.
But what is it about when we see like a Joaquin Phoenix become Johnny Cash that we go, oh yeah, man, that's like, I mean, why is it that Joaquin Phoenix playing a normal person or Joaquin Phoenix playing a different person from history, why is it when Joaquin Phoenix plays a musician, we're like, oh, that man, he deserves an Academy Award? What is it about watching an actor who is a performer portray a musician who is a performer? Why do we always give it up so
it's
quickly?
Like I'm saying, like people think they know these people from listening to their music for so many years, and then the performer gets up there and tries to embody them, tries to flesh out this image, this idea you've had of this person for years, and it's very satisfying. I mean, well, it's satisfying if it works, and it's unsatisfying if it doesn't. Although I don't know, I can't even think of a biopic disaster. I guess they just never get. I guess they get shelved because it's like it becomes so obvious. Huh?
Listomania.
Listomania by Ken Russell. It was made in the 70s.
About Listomania.
You know what? I watched that, but
we should do a whole show on that.
Would Amadeus be considered a musical?
Yes,
bio?
yes, absolutely. Based on a play. And that's a weird thing because this is my other question to you guys. So, like, yeah, this is great. Thank you for setting me up. Amadeus comes out in 1984. It is based on a Tony Schaefer London play that became a Broadway success. It's about Amadeus Mozart and Salieri, and it is absolutely based on real music, how it tells a full story. And they even took the actors from the Broadway production and they made them the leads in the film, and it did great. I forgot who directed that movie again, Amadeus?
He directed One Flew Over the Skull. Milos Forman.
Right, great Czech director. I mean, it won everything. It did superbly well. But if you've noticed in this century, every time they take a very successful Broadway musical like Jersey Boys, which is about the Four Seasons, or even, let's say, not even a biopic, but just a straight up musical like West Side Story, which just came out, they just bomb. They don't make a lot of money. They don't win a lot of awards. I mean, for as much love as we give our actors for doing real life musicians, I mean, real life people, we get really mad when they do Cats. So why do you think it is that we love when someone like Chadwick Boseman can play James Brown, but when Taylor Swift does Cats, we're like, I want to hate her. What's going on there, guys? Well, why can't musicals make it like musical biopics?
I think some of it has to do with most artists, not all, most artists struggle. They'll either struggle with relationships, they'll struggle with addiction, they'll struggle with something in their lives. A lot of artists create through pain. And I think right there is the central conflict to a lot of these stories. And I think that's why you see a lot of actors gravitate toward these kind of roles, because there is a mountain to climb with these characters, and it's more dramatic as opposed to telling, the best biopics are the ones where the main characters are struggling with themselves and trying to create. And I think that's one reason. I don't think it is the reason, but I also do think that the music, especially, I keep bringing up Queen, Bohemian Rhapsody. I mean, you look at the popularity of Queen has not really waned that much. It's only gotten more popular. And I think the catalogs of these music, they're yet to do a Led Zeppelin biopic or a Jimi Hendrix biopic, but I think there's a longing for a recognition of this music, because the music, I don't think they'll be doing biopics of K-pop in 20 years. Maybe they will. I don't know.
I'm no longer going to hold back the dam of nostalgia. So,
well, I have an economic reason. It's because I think the musical-based movies, they're not trying to be saleable movies. They're trying to be advertisements for the musical. And I think that these biopics, they need to be successful as a movie, because in a sense they are advertisements for the artists and the work, and for concerts. But it won't work unless it's a good movie. But yeah, I mean, the audience for musicals is so small that I really think that the movie musicals. The movies based on musicals, they're slavishly devoted to getting the musical right, and
that's a really good point. I mean, you're right. There's a lack of freedom,
and they don't have to be hit movies. They just have to sell the musical, because there's gonna be a small amount of people to see it, and then they're gonna go want to see the musical.
But what I also think too. I think audiences are definitely more mature, and we talked about West Side Story, and that musical failed as a film. And I think one of the reasons is people have a hard time with characters suddenly breaking out into song. Whereas with musical bios, that's not the case. You have artists recreating a concert or recreating a recording session, and people feel more comfortable, or it's grounded more in reality. Whereas musicals, I still think audiences of today do have problems with characters just suddenly breaking out into song.
So it's possible that there might be too much singing in musicals, whereas musical biopics don't. I mean, let's be blunt, right? There's only a couple of songs in any musical biopic. but it's not like a musical, which is almost wall to wall sound.
Well, usually biopics are more like concert movies where when the music comes on, they're actually playing it. It's like a concert, but yeah, musicals are like they've always been weird. I mean, everybody's always thought musicals were weird. I mean,
Well, I'm a big musical theater fan, so no, you're 100% wrong. I love musicals, and I loved West Side Story, and I thought it was awesome, just like I thought Sweeney Todd was great. But I will say, you non-musical theater people who didn't grow up in New York City, I get it. It does not cross over, and we're gonna go on to another question because I'm.
Well, let me just finish the one other point. I think the audiences that see these musical bios usually are familiar with the artist's music, so they're going into the theater predisposed, knowing their music. And so they know when the Queen song hits or the Elton John, and they could sing the lyrics. Whereas musicals, West Side Story, yes, people may know a couple of songs from that musical, but they're going to know the catalog of most of these musical artists from the bio.
Okay, I'm going to come back on that right now on you and say you are correct, and I'll explain why. Because the golden age of Hollywood musicals is between, I'd say, the 1940s with the beginning of Oklahoma and the early 70s with the end with Fiddler on the Roof and Cabaret. That's like the great period of Hollywood musicals. No one's going to argue with me on that one, right? Good. The generation of people who were in their 20s, 30s, and 40s, and even 50s in that period of time, show tunes were the pop music from the early 40s right through to the 60s, and it carried over even into the 70s. So when people would go to see a lot of these movies like Oklahoma, for example, or Sound of Music, another great example, they already knew the songs. And you're correct. Today, no one listens. Pop radio does not play, unless you got series, they don't play show tunes. So people don't know show tunes when they go into. So I think you've hit something very amazing and solid, which is there's this thing, and Randall and I have maybe a year ago, we did this thing about FM radio being so insanely Gen X that now when you turn on the radio, you always hear a song that you know all the lyrics to. And maybe that's something that is really part of the joy of watching the musical biopic, is to watch an actor who you have seen in other things go and take the challenge of singing like Freddie Mercury. Is that kind of what's going on there, gentlemen? Because we know what they're trying to do.
I don't know. I think it's like the acting you're watching for, because like with today's electronic trickery, it's like, who knows if the actor is really singing.
Yeah, but are we going in with that saying like, man, wouldn't it be cool? I know this song by heart. They know this song by heart. Let's see like how they take it. Is this kind of like watching one of those TV shows where people just do covers? Is that maybe where we're at, guys? Because you're right. There is a predictability. It's not a predictability in the film.
You have a point. I mean, a lot of these movies, they take great pains to make it seem like the actor's actually singing. Like I think La La Land, like the director went to a lot of pains to like actually have the actors sing, and supposedly. But I don't. But who knows if that's really the case? I mean,
but it's not even if they're doing some singing.
Well, I think when an actor does their own singing in a film, it's usually foreshadowed in the advertising. You'll know that they're singing the song. One movie in particular comes to mind is the Buddy Holly story with Gary Busey, who was nominated for Best Actor for that film, and he did all his own singing in that movie, and he sounded exactly like Buddy Holly. But you'd be hard pressed for anybody to recreate Freddie Mercury's voice. There's just no way. He had one of the most original voices in rock. So,
but Jamie Foxx did do his own singing in Ray. I know that, and I know.
No, he did not. No, they used Ray in that. They used the original recordings because Taylor Hackford had been very close with the family for 10 years. He worked on that project, and he was privy to a lot of recordings, and they used Jamie Foxx did use, there were several sequences where his own voice was used, but usually the concert sequences or the recording sequences was Ray Charles.
How about Joaquin Phoenix?
That's a good question. I don't know about that one.
I think he did. I think he and
I think he did.
Reese Witherspoon really did sing, and it's kind of fun because you know they're not going to be great. You're not watching them trying to be like Beatlemania, you know, a complete live recreation. You just want to watch their take. But I'm going to go to a different question that I shutted you guys down too early, which is, so how do you talked about nostalgia. So how does these 21st century musical biopics tell the story of music in the 20th century, specifically pop music? And what is it that do you feel like in a way, a lot of these films cover the same ground, you know, and if you've ever watched any of the World War II movies, or if you've ever watched any of the movies about the Windsors, you could almost you could line up a certain amount of these films and they would tell you the story of Motown. They would tell you the story of the 60s rock and roll movement. They would tell you the story of the 70s punk movement. They tell you the story of the 80s hip hop movement. So let's just pretend, let's not even talk about them as works of music, but as social historians, how do they convey social history, gentlemen?
Well, I think a lot of these movies, they're not only about the artist, but about the genre the artist comes out of. You know, we've talked about this on other shows about art. It's like, most artists come out of a community, so you get to see in a lot of these the community those artists come out of, the community the genre comes out of, and do they take it all together? Do they tell some kind of unified history? I would say no. Each one is examining a sort of milieu that the genre sprung out of.
I disagree. I really do think, collectively speaking, when you watch these things, you are learning about the 60s. You are learning about the war movement. You're learning what it's like to be an African-American musician in the 1940s and the 1950s. You're looking at the Vietnam War. You're looking at drugs and alcohol issues from the 60s and 70s. And I think what's interesting is traditionally, Hollywood would normally tell stories about history either by telling war stories, or they would tell the stories of the great man or the great woman who made a big change, who was not a musician. And I think because music is so much about subcultures, it does allow for a certain degree of social history that other genres of film don't really allow. So I do think when you're watching these films, I mean, maybe Bill, I'd love to hear your thoughts on what are they saying? What do you feel is the message about America or even the world, or just the music industry in general that they're trying to say?
There was a movie that was made in 1996. It was called Grace of My Heart. Right. And it was a fictional look at a fictitious record company, and how they did business, how they recorded, how they signed stars in the 1950s and the 60s, and how it was sort of like how music was sort of manufactured, sort of like a fictitious Motown. And I think throughout the movie, the main character is a woman, and it's her, you know, constant battle trying to overcome this man's world. I think these movies that are being made today, and I keep going back to the Elton John musical biopic, you know, that movie had a lot to do with his sexuality. So I think what they can do, and the reason why maybe they're popular, is because they show the groundbreaking field that they were able to change. You know, they were able to do something that nobody else had done, and I think that's the appeal of I think a lot of these movies.
You know, you're raising a really good point from a social historical perspective, that, you know, these films really do deal with like what it's like to be a woman in the world of music production, what it's like to be an African American during the time of race records, what it's like to be a closeted homosexual during the very hetero 1970s rock movement, or a great composer like Cole Porter, or what it's like to deal with alcohol or drugs as not as a flaw of character, but as an actual chemical dependency issue. And I do feel like in many ways, what's kind of really wonderful, if we look at it from a social historical perspective, is that the music industry was a great haven for people who didn't have opportunities elsewhere, right? I mean, a lot of immigrants or the children of immigrants got their break writing songs for the Brill Building. A lot of Jewish kids, Italian American kids, and then a lot of African Americans would come in on the scene and they would do those songs, and then white artists would pick them up. So there's a lot of people who in traditional history books, wow, that aren't really covered when we study American history. And so I feel like in many ways what we're getting here is almost an alternative, is that Howard Zinn thing, like an alternative American history from the less represented people. What was it like?
Yeah. I think that the reason that happens is because, in a certain sense, pop music especially is a meritocracy. And thanks to the mathematical law of regression to the mean, you're never going to have a hereditary line of hit makers. I mean, that's impossible, thanks to regression to the mean. So yeah, you're going to get a cross-sectional representation from society of pop artists.
Any thoughts, Bill?
No, I
Bill agrees with me.
I agree with Randall.
Oh no, but because it's just I'm really finding it so fascinating that I think part of the success and what I think it's very hard to see a lot of historical movies, not knocking movies like say Lincoln or Gandhi, because there's so much of history movies where we already know about the history. So there isn't a lot of new ground to cover. But because when we were growing up, there wasn't a lot of American history about what it was like to be African American, an immigrant in the 20th century, gay, any of these groups. Today's younger kids, it's very funny how people go, oh man, I don't want to see another woke movie. And like, well, nothing is woker normally than your contemporary rock musical biopic. And yet even like the most, sorry to say this, most anti-woke person will still show up to watch Bohemian Rhapsody, which is pretty freaking shocking if you take the minutes.
Yeah, you're right. Well, it's because the real world is woke. And that's just how it is. I mean, you have to, to get outside of like a woke, representation of the universe. It's like you have to create fantasy.
Well, that's a good. So
that's my opinion.
No, but you've made a really good point. So we've talked about this before, gentlemen, and there's this war. I really feel, and not war in like here's one is good or one is bad, but do musical biopics need to be factually accurate? Because we've seen both semi-realistic, where they approximate accuracy, and fantasies as well, and stuff in between. What do you guys feel about the dichotomy between musical biopics that are realistic, and how realistic should they be? Well, and then I'll ask you guys about the fantasies.
Well, let me just say something first on this, because like this is turning into my pet peeve in the modern era, because like, with the internet, you can look up everything, every single detail of every single story now. And I'm starting to hate it when movies and TV shows like aren't 100% accurate. I mean, it's like, it's a silly thing to get irritated by, but it's like, it's starting to irritate me because I keep watching based on a true story stuff and it's not exactly right. I mean, if it's not exactly right and it's like, it doesn't really, the details they change aren't really that important, it's fine. But when they start changing things that really seem things of significance, it does start to irritate me.
Well, Bill, I know that you are a screenwriter and a playwright of historical works. As a writer working in that milieu, in that area, how do writers work in biopics? Where do they find the line between what to include and what to have to alter, shade?
I think because of the internet, and information can be verified so quickly, there is this sense where that movies have to be accurate. There was a movie that came out in 2015. It was Aaron Sorkin's Steve Jobs, and he was criticized for that film because he conflated 3 large events in a 24 or 48 hour period, and they confronted him about the accuracy of the tale he was telling. And he basically said, I'm a dramatist. I'm not a historian, I'm a dramatist. And I'm going to create drama where there is no drama. Because if you were to really tell the story of anybody, any famous person, we're talking about stories that are 40 years long to tell. You have to condense them. You have to create drama out of them. So it's tough. There was another movie with Denzel Washington about a boxer called The Hurricane. And that movie got a rash of criticism because they distorted some of the facts about what had happened to him in jail and why he was put in jail. And so I think there's become more of pressure on writers to be more accurate in telling their tale.
But I mean, look, in a minute or two, we're going to talk about our favorite films. Every single one of them, I looked them up, have factual inaccuracies. So on some level, how do you guys make peace when you're watching this? I mean, they're adding new details. If they're done really well and they're realistic, right? We get to know something about the artist we didn't know. That's pretty cool and amazing. But they're not documentaries. Is it fair to go into a biopic expecting it will be like a documentary?
My personal opinion, yes. I think they should be like documentaries now. I am an absolutist. I'm irritated. You know, if they do make changes, I should understand why they make the changes. I mean, some of these changes they make, I mean, it's like they don't even make any sense sometimes.
Well, I don't want you to be kowtowed by Randall's rather strong and persuasive argument, but Bill, how do you feel about it? I mean, what's okay to fudge and what's not okay?
Well, I have two examples, and it's two of the movies that I picked. I know we'll talk about them, but
yeah.
Ray with Jamie Foxx and Get On Up about James Brown with Chadwick Boseman. And Get On Up was a warts and all portrayal of James Brown, his drug addiction, his womanizing, his hatred of his own band members. They didn't hold anything back. Then you had Ray, which is a great film, and it's one of my favorite biopics. But Ray Charles' womanizing was sort of pulled back a little. They didn't really get into all the children that he fathered out of wedlock. They kind of left that out. It's a fine line, and nobody's perfect when you're telling these stories, and they're all flawed individuals. And so I guess it's the perspective of the director. Does he want to leave certain facts out to preserve the integrity of the character, or do they want to put extra facts in to do the opposite? I don't know. It's very hard to tell a story about someone's life in 2 hours. You can't do it.
Good point. And then let's go to the opposite end of the spectrum. And we're going to get into these films a little bit sooner, but Rocket Man, which I don't think is in anyone's list. Is that right? None of us.
No,
Rocket Man?
I don't think so.
Yeah. So Rocket Man is a total fantasy. Now, it's not a total. There was once a movie, I think it came out in this century, but it could have been the late 90s, which was a what if story directed by Michael Lindsay Hogg, where it was about what if John Lennon and Paul McCartney sat down, visited each other, and hung out at the Dakota, and then chatted, and then went down to Saturday Night Live to collect that $500 from Lauren Michael and perform, which is a total fantasy. And then there is the less fantasy version, which is Rocket Man, which still has these very strange, surrealistic moments that have absolutely, like, he's floating, he's flying, he's talking to his younger self. By the way, that also happens in Ray, where he's hugging his younger self. There's all these very kind of beautiful, I want to say, I'm a big fan of opera, which is done terribly, by the way, in American cinema. Don't even try it. But one thing I love about opera is about heightened reality, where the emotions are so strong that it doesn't have to be real intellectually true as long as it's emotionally true. And I wanted to get your take. What do you guys think about the more fantasy-like stuff, like a Rocket Man? I know there's more, but I'm just going to stick on Rocket Man.
I'll just say that I'll just say that I don't mind fantasy sequences when they're trying to get at a deeper truth or trying to compress content, because it's obvious that it's not real. Okay, but when these movies try to create all sorts of characters and scenes that are completely not real, and they try to portray them as real, that there's something disingenuous about that. I feel.
I understand, but what do you feel about the fantasy approach? Just as a,
well, like I said, it's fine. I like it.
It's fine, but what do you guys feel like the fantasy approach works to a different end than the realism approach? And if so, what are the two different ends? What is the end that the fantasy approach works towards? Why do you like it when you know when they're taking giant ass liberties?
Well,
why are we like,
they're trying to compress?
Cool.
They're trying to compress some of the story. I mean,
no, but like when you're flying in the sky, defying the laws of what human beings.
They're trying to illustrate what Elton John feels like at that point in his career.
Well, I think that's why a fantasy sequence in that film works, because the hardest thing to portray in film with an artist is the creative process. How did the artist create this song? What was going through his mind? And it's very, very, very hard to do that. So using a fantasy sequence to try to explain to the viewer how this song was created, what he was thinking emotionally, what he was thinking in his life, I think is a great technique to show the creative process. Because otherwise it's very, very hard. You could show the actor tinkling around on the piano or writing notes in on music sheet. You're not conveying any emotion. You're not really showing how the inspiration occurred. So a fantasy sequence is a great way to do that, to evoke emotion and show the viewer how this person was feeling and why they wrote this song and what it conveyed. And that's why I think the fantasy sequences in Rocket Man are the strongest suit of that film, whereas the melodramatic scenes in that movie are, in my opinion, ham-fisted.
You really raise a good point, which is that biopics aren't just traditional. They're not just about, oh, he became president, he becomes a boxer. No, it is really about the creative process. And the creative process involves imagination and interpretation. And the really good biopics let us feel like, as you say, we're riding along with the creative process. So by the end of the film, when they get to that big song, if that's the way it ends, we can get how they got to that place where that song really has the great release that we want, which you also see, by the way, folks, in an aria in opera. I'm going to give it up on opera. So I'm totally switching trains for a second. We've talked about nostalgia and music. That's awesome. But so many of these films really take place between the 1970s to the end of the 20th century. So many of these films are about our childhood, our young adulthood. We're mixed in. On this show, we've got some Gen X people, we got a boomer, but you and I are also cuspers, Bill, because we were both born like 2 years apart. So because you were born 2 years earlier, you were a boomer, and I'm 2 years later. I'm a Gen Xer. Randall, you're a healthy mid-70s baby, so you own Gen X.
Should we say our ages, the time of recording, so people understand what you're talking about?
No, we just can talk about what part of the.
I could care less about my age. I'm 58. I'm pushing 60. I don't care.
I'm 56 and I'm pushing 57.
I'm about to be 47, I think.
Oh okay. My God. Well, watch out, because that's when the little gem changes color. Wow. See, Logan's Run reference. My point is, we're watching history. We're now watching. A lot of these films are about people who we did really remember the real person. We do remember hearing that song for the first time. We do remember that when they got into trouble with the police, or when they got divorced, or when they got drunk, or when they put out that album. What is the effect of music biopics? Are really the only genre that I can really say is consistent in showing Gen X and boomers their history back to them. How does that feel, guys, seeing the 90s, the 80s, the 70s thrown back in your face?
Personally, I think it's depressing, but I mean, I remember, I remember when these songs came out, so I'm watching a movie like, oh my God, I think that the people that greenlight movies, are probably, maybe my age, maybe younger. So they're gonna say yes to films, musical bios that they can relate to. Whereas, 10 years from now, are they going to do a musical bio on Nirvana? Is there going to be, I mean, we're going to see the same thing. It's going to become nostalgic to go into the 90s. I think it's already happening. I'm getting a sense right now that we're still stuck in the 80s. I don't know why that is.
No, we're actually, there was an article, we're moving into the 90s now.
Are we moving into the 90s? Oh, yeah. Okay, so music in the 90s, I think
the millennials are getting ready they're getting up on next on deck.
Yeah, I think music of the 90s, I think is the last great decade of music. I think after that, for whatever reason, it's...
I totally agree.
They talk about in film, what is it called, the Four Quadrants? Can you explain that a little bit? What they talk about when a four quadrant film?
No, I do not know that.
Okay. So apparently there are 4 different groups of people who go to the movies.
Okay.
And one of the easiest groups to get is women. And young people are another easy group to get. Older people, older than us, are pretty damn hard. And our generation, which finally showed up for Top Gun Maverick, 2 years, we're now going back to the theater. We're a hard generation to bring. So boomers, Gen Xers, and guys in particular, very hard. But it does seem like these musical biopics that are mostly about like rock or variations thereof or hip hop, they tend to bring in boomers, Gen Xers, and men. And they tend to, the young people will come out of curiosity. Maybe the women will come, same difference. I don't know. I'm not trying to be sexist here. But there is something about this, kind of like superhero movies. There is a certain similarity between superhero movies and musical biopics in that they're about people who are exceptional, and B, they draw in a lot of men. So what is it about this genre, you think, that actually brings in these people who would normally come to watch a movie? Is it just, you tell me, guys. And then silence game.
Okay. What do you think? What do you think, Chris?
Well, I think that comic books, for the most part, became super popular in the 70s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. The average comic book reader is about 40. And I think, weirdly enough, a lot of the very people who go to see these Avengers movies, the Batman, Superman movies, are the very same people who are also going to see movies that are about, rock bands like Queen and Elton John. There's a certain kind of person who looks just like you and me, who hence the show, who doesn't really want to go to the movie theater unless there's something that they can relate to. And I think we love fantasy. And whether it's about a superhero or it's about a rock star, I think our generation, because we're not the video game generation, nor we're a tremendously athletic generation. I know you are, Bill. I think our wish fulfillment characters are rock stars, are superheroes. And I think part of the appeal of these films is to see the lives of exceptional people doing things exceptionally well, and yet still struggling like we do. What do you guys think of that?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's part of it. I mean, almost all these movies are about men who are making their way in the world based on their own skills and talent and hard work. I mean, it's the working man's fantasy.
Yeah, I think so. What do you think, Bill?
Yeah, no, I agree.
And again, I'm not trying to rule out women, because we're now about to get to our favorite 3 films that we're going to mention, and both of you guys have given representation to females. I'm the sexist pig who completely forgot and just likes movies about men who are actually very terrible to women.
Well, I'm thinking that, like,
sorry.
Well, I'm thinking that Coal Miner's Daughter that was mentioned earlier, Bill mentioned that earlier, that might be the only movie that fits this model, like where it is starring a female performer. I mean, I can't even think of another one.
Well, you're going to find out in just a sec. Let's start out with our top 3 films. Bill, give us yours.
My top 3, in order, let's see, third would be Ray with Jamie Foxx. I love that movie. I think it's the strength of Jamie Foxx's performance that guides you through that film. I think it's very formulaic. but it works because I do like the formula of a biopic. And it starts from, it ends in 1966, I believe. And so it doesn't go through his entire life. And I think that's one of its strengths. It wasn't completely chronological. My second favorite film is La Vie en Rose. And I think that we were talking about women biopics.
Édith Piaf.
Piaf was one of the great French singers, and the performance of Marianne Cotillard is amazing. I think she won an Academy Award for Best Actress. That movie is not told in a linear fashion. It's not told chronologically. It's all over the place. I think that's the strength of that film, because she had Édith Piaf had such an interesting life. She grew up in a bordello. She was raised by prostitutes. She died of a heroin overdose in her late 40s, and she had many relationships, and it's just told, it's almost as though you're experiencing her life with her. It's because it's told, it's almost like a stream of consciousness, that film, and that's what's so great about it. And obviously the music, and Édith Piaf, her original recordings are used in that film. But my top movie for musical biopic is Get On Up, and Chadwick Boseman. I love James Brown. I saw James Brown in the 1980s in the Valley at the Reseda Country Club. My dad was a big James Brown fan, and I didn't even know who he was. And this was about the time he did Rocky II, Rocky III. He did a song for Rocky III. He had this kind of resurgence in his career. And I remember seeing James Brown and just how electrifying this man was, and seeing Chadwick Boseman recreate James Brown is absolutely amazing. But I mentioned it before. The reason why I think this movie is so great is because it doesn't hold anything back. James Brown was a very complicated individual, extremely complicated, with a lot of things in his past that he was honest about, that forthcoming, and that he had no regrets. And he had drug addiction, he was womanizing, alcoholism, money issues. You can go down the list of the things that he went through, and it's all portrayed in the film, and with an electrifying performance, and there's a truth that comes out of that film that for me makes it one of the best musical bios ever made, in my opinion.
You know, it's really interesting that all three of those people, and I'm not trying to be mean, they're all people whose career really hit in the middle of the 20th century, who were all drug addicts, who had very hard lives, who were very sexually promiscuous, and kind of all met with a very sad end. And it's weird to think about, but La Vie en Rose feels to me like it leans far more into the tragedy, whereas I think Ray and James Brown both go out a little earlier than the story. So you're kind of getting out on a high note, but these are all dark.
Well, Édith Piaf, her music was tragic. If you listen to her music, it was tragic. She evoked an emotion. You would listen to her to this day. You listen to her music and you're sad. Not all of her music was sad, but her best stuff. She was a torch singer. She knew how to plug into that emotion because of her life was a tragedy. So she was able to communicate that. And that's what made her so great. So anyway, those are my three.
No, but it's really good. I mean, those are all very soulful people who sang very soulful songs, who all made a career out of singing about pain and joy. Randall, any thoughts on any of those films that Bill picked?
Yeah, well, like I said before, I love realism. I hate it when they try to sanitize things or change things around. So yeah, the James Brown movie, yeah, great pick.
You know, it's really interesting. Chadwick Boseman, it should have done better.
Oh yeah, it wasn't very successful, but
I remember Randall amazing. And I were originally going to do a much bigger show on this topic, and I was really hesitant to watch it. And then when I did, I'm like, damn, the film, it just suffered from having a poor promotion. Randall, what are your top three?
All right. Well, My weakest choice, I think, at all these is Behind the Candelabra. I mean, it's a fascinating movie because you get to go. It delves deep into Liberace's character, and which is fascinating because Liberace is a real character. I mean, the performances are amazing. Bill, you're saying you love Michael Douglas. I mean,
oh, he's great.
This could be.
I mean, that performance. I mean, a very brave performer. Like Michael Douglas put everything into that. Was not afraid to portray Liberace, and that's what made it so great.
This could be Michael Douglas's greatest performance. I mean, he really
absolutely,
definitely
absolutely.
Up there. And I think you have to give it up to Matt Damon as well.
Oh yeah, Matt Damon's fantastic in it, but it's Michael Douglas. And he didn't. I mean, Liberace in real life, he was so theatrical, and he always made fun of his. The funny thing about him was, his sexuality was always a mystery, or he pretended to be, straight. In fact, there was a famous libel lawsuit that he won in London. They wrote an article saying he was a homosexual, and he sued and he won. But in real life, I mean, he was just very gay, very, very into his sexuality. And that's what makes the movie so great, is because he was two different people. And that's the complex character. And I think that's one of the reasons why Michael Douglas probably took the part, is because there really, really was such a dichotomy with Liberace that it's just a fascinating tale. I love that movie.
Yeah, and talk about warts and all. I mean, Liberace, I mean, by the end, I think you're going to hate Liberace like everybody else. But I don't know. Maybe you'll feel for him. Maybe you'll feel for him.
I did. I totally felt for him. I felt so bad for him.
You do feel for him. There's a lot of pain.
Absolutely.
There's the least amount of music of all of the ones. But, man, Anyway, it's your turn. What is your other picks? I'm sorry, man.
Okay, so I liked Bohemian Rhapsody as well. I mean, Freddie Mercury was a musical genius. And, something I like about movies about art is where they depict the artist actually making the art, and you see what the process they went through was. And I realize that most people in the world don't care about this kind of stuff, but that's what I want to see in a movie like this. And the Bohemian Rhapsody movie has some of that, and it's good. It's fun. My number one movie is the Runaways, because that's exactly what I'm talking about. You see how what's his name, the
Cherry, no, what's her name, the lead singer you're talking about?
No, you see how the Kim Fowley, the producer of the band, creates the band and invents the Runaways, and the whole movie is about that. And so this in my opinion is like the greatest music biopic of all time, because it's completely devoted to depicting the process, depicting the community that the band comes out of, depicting the milieu, depicting the machinations they have to go through, the economics of it. It's and what and how it affects all the people in the band ultimately.
These are really fascinating picks, because without planning it, I know you have two gay men and one lesbian woman. Played by a bisexual, actually, and it's good because you really don't think about Joan Jett. I think what's really fascinating, not obviously Behind the Candelabra, but when you look at like Freddie Mercury, look at all three of them. They all really were good at and I don't mean this in a mean way, but they were able to cross over to people who had very opposite feelings about LGBTQI. I know a lot of guys who love Joan Jett who don't really get Joan Jett, if you know what I'm talking about. And it's the same thing with Queen, and I think if our generation is at all more progressive than the generations that came before it, it's because we were able to have heroes like Freddie Mercury, like Elton John, like Joan Jett, who could rock like anybody else pretty fucking hard, and yet were unapologetic about their sexual identity. So if you better accept them if you want to accept their music.
You know what, Chris? That is an interesting point you're making. I didn't realize I picked all LGBTQ plus friendly movies. But now that you say that, Okay, well,
I picked three artists with addiction problems. So
right, but now I picked 3 films about men who are really monsters. 3 living white men, straight, who were really shitty husbands and probably crap dads. So leave it to Chris to do the opposite. Hey, I'm a middle-aged white man. Let me just play my hits. So instead of picking in order of favorites, I'm going to just talk about it in order of most realistic to least realistic, but I love them all. So the first film I picked is Straight Outta Compton, which is actually the one that came out the most recently, 2015. It's about NWA, and it's directed by Gary F. Gray, who was one of my favorite directors. He just recently passed away. And it's interesting because, and I think this is definitely true with Bohemian Rhapsody, that Queen worked with the filmmakers on Bohemian Rhapsody. I'm pretty sure that some of the women from Runaways did work with the filmmaker on Runaways. I'm pretty sure that Ray Charles did work with Taylor Hackford or the Charles family, right, on Ray.
Yes.
So, you know, Ice Cube, besides being a performer, is also a screenwriter, and one of his earliest scripts is Friday, which was also directed by Gary F. Gray. And it is really kind of fascinating that, and I think even Cube has his son is in this, or no, it's Dre's son. So the director is intimately familiar with these people in a way that you don't normally see. And by having the son of one of the actors play his dad, there is, I mean, it does this film take liberties? I looked it up. Hell yeah. There's a lot of this stuff where they're like, and are there dark parts of Dre that they do not even get to? Of course. But what I really love about this, first off, I'm not a giant fan of hip hop or rap. And I'm not even a really giant fan of NWA. I know like 3 songs. It's the same 3 songs everybody knows. And I don't know how many of them I can even say without us getting beat. No, it was a free show. Anyway, my point is this. What was my point? I like the film as an origin story. First off, I think of all the musical biopics we've talked about, it's the best one that shows a band. The Runaways comes damn close, and so does Bohemian Rhapsody. But not just Kim Fowley, but you know, Jerry Heller, who was played here by Paul Giamatti, just wonderful, and Suge Knight. They're really both. I mean, in some ways, as bad as Jerry Heller is, Suge Knight's like Dr. Doom. But you talk about the 3 of the 5 guys, which is Dre, Cube, and Eazy-E, and you talk about their the conflicts and how much fighting goes on in the creative process. And collaboration is something that you rarely see in biopics done right, because collaboration is pretty nasty. And these are people who, on one hand, there's a lot of love and there's a lot of hate. And I think creative people come in with their emotions. Plus, the other thing I really love about it, and this is something that's really true about the filmmaker Gary F. Gray, is he's so good at doing social realism. There's a scene in this movie where they're recording Straight Outta Compton in Torrance. And they step outside for the recording studio, and the police come up to them and almost arrest them for looking suspicious. And I looked it up. That is a real scene. That really happened. Just like they really got arrested in St. Louis when they did Fuck the Police. I mean, you know, these guys in their own way were all just like the punk movement in England. And it really does kind of, like, it does a good job of dealing with racism. And not just racism in the 50s or 60s, but racism in our own lifetime. You know, it really, I mean, we all lived through the riots, but, you know, it reminded me that there was something going on, you know, and it does a really good job. The ending is the fake ending. And that might be the weakest point, is I don't buy the ending, and the ending is kind of like, hey, everybody loves each other at the end. No, but you look at like where Ice Cube would end up going, where Dre would end up going, and the legacy of these guys, and you see them as both individuals and a group, and I just think it does an excellent job of very much showing that process. The next one I will pick also features Paul Giamatti as the villain, Dr. Eugene Landy, is Love and Mercy, which came out the year before in 2014. And now that one, we've been talking before about realism and non-realism. And this is not really a fantasy, but it makes a really interesting choice, which is it's about Brian Wilson at two distinct points in his life. And I know that certainly in La Vie en Rose, there's a lot of flashback, but it's always Marianne Cotillard who plays Marianne Cotillard, whether she's in her 20s or her 40s. In fact, I think she plays herself as a teenager too. Don't quote me on that. Whereas here, you have Paul Dano as the Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys, and then you have in the 80s, John Cusack as Brian Wilson, basically a recovering alcoholic and drug addict. And I honestly don't think they look very similar to each other, and they sure as hell don't look anything like Brian Wilson. Well, actually, Paul Dano kind of does look like a young Brian Wilson, but through parallel structure, they're really able to show how what goes on in one period of a life reverberates to another. It gives you a sense of it. And I think it's a very bold choice to keep them so separate. I also have to say the part where they're working on pet sounds is wonderful. There's not a lot of music in the film, and what music there is, the better stuff, just like with Brian Wilson in general, sadly, is the Beach Boys era. But watching young Brian Wilson really struggling and really coming up with this very orchestral thing of pet sounds, that to me really is what you were talking about earlier, where we get to eat the creative process and see how the sausage is made.
That was pretty good in Love and Mercy, yes.
So now I'm going to pick the one movie that is just super far out. And if you're going to go, hey, Chris, do you recommend this movie? I'd be like, I don't know if I recommend this movie, but here's how we go. It came out in 2007. It's by Todd Haynes, and it's called I'm Not There. Now, this movie doesn't make any attempts at realism or accuracy. It's conceptually about Bob Dylan, but it's a series of small stories inspired by real things that happened in his life or songs he wrote, with a myriad amount of different actors, including a young African-American child, and also, is it Tilda Swinton who plays them? I'm going to look it up. I always confuse Tilda Swinton with one other actor. Well, we're going to say Tilda Swinton as Bob Dylan. Also,
it was Kate
Richard
Blanchett,
Gere
I
as
think. Kate
Blanchett. Thank you. Kate Blanchett. You've got Heath Ledger. You've got Kristen Bale. You have Richard Gere, and it's a very metaphysical play. It's like, and it does deal with words and things that are part of what it's funny is that I've never seen a musical biopic that instead of even trying to deal with the man, they dealt with the mythos. It deals with what we know of Bob Dylan, not by fact as much as by reputation. A little bit of fact, as they do lift different experiences and words and texts he has said, and they do end it with a concert footage. And it's really less about Bob Dylan, the man, and more about Bob Dylan, the social experience, which is what I kind of love about it. What do you guys think? If you don't love it, it's totally cool. If you haven't seen it, watch it.
Summed it up well. I remember, it's been a while since I watched it, but I remember Kate Blanchett was my favorite playing Bob Dylan. She
was nominated for an Academy Award.
Yeah, her performance is spectacular. She's playing a man, and I didn't even know it was her. I thought it was a guy actor, until halfway through. I didn't.
And it's kind of crazy because they are making a new Bob Dylan film with Timothy Chalamet as Bob Dylan, and you could argue that there's no way that Timothy Chalamet could be as good as Kate Blanchett.
Yeah, they should have just picked her again.
It is a weird thought to think, but so guys, I did want to just get to where we're headed in the future, which is I think that you're now seeing this on TV. There's a Sex Pistols TV show. There was a Wu-Tang TV show. This month is a movie about Elvis Presley. I just been watching how Netflix is doing a Leonard Bernstein movie with Bradley Cooper, and if you look on the internet, you can see what an amazing job they did of making him look like Bradley Cooper.
He's getting a lot of criticism for that right now, isn't he?
Yes, he is. But
for doing what?
he has a prosthetic nose, like Leonard Bernstein.
Yeah. So,
but people are criticizing it.
And once again, it at least it's going to deal with his homosexuality in a way that's more honest than it would have been made if it had come out at a different time in history, which is awesome. Austin Butler, on the other hand, is playing Elvis Presley. I've never seen Austin Butler. This will make his career. So, guys, as I started out at the beginning, why do you think these, in one word, or just briefly to sum up, why are these so popular? What are these films are saying, and where do you think this is going to go? How long do you think it's going to play
out? I think it's going to play out when they start running out of good musicians, and so I think that's when, we're yet to see a Beatles film. I mean, we've seen a few things, but a Beatles, Rolling Stones, Led Zeppelin. I mean, you can go down the list, but I am looking forward to the Elvis Presley one. Only because, I'll date myself, I saw Elvis Presley when I was a kid in Las Vegas at the Hilton,
wow.
And my parents took me. It was 1971. I was 8 years old. I didn't even know, really, I didn't even know who Elvis was. My dad took me, and it was an hour show, and he had the sequins and the jumpsuit and the whole 9 yards. But I do remember a 9-minute version of Suspicious Minds that blew me away. And I've been an Elvis Presley fan ever since. That movie, from what I've been reading, is trying to evoke the emotion of Elvis when he first appeared. When he first appeared, he was an anomaly. No one had ever seen anything like him, a white guy. No one had ever seen anything like it. And of course, he did steal from all the black musicians of the time. But he was almost like a punk artist. He was almost like, so he's trying to evoke the emotion of it. And I think,
yeah, but it's so cool. He also had people like Lieber and Stoller, two Jewish kids, first generation Americans, writing. Yes, he stole from Big Mama Thornton, but it was Mama Thornton with these two white kids whose parents are from Eastern Europe. They wrote from Big Mama Thornton. So there is an interconnective. Anyway, I'm sorry, getting on a tangent. I just want to know, where do you think, given your deep connections with Hollywood, are we at the end of a trend? Or
no, we have another decade of the 90s, and there's a lot of great bands that came out of the 90s. When I think, what are we, 2022? I think 2032 will run out because there's no good music left.
Randall, any final thoughts yourself on this?
Yeah, Gigi Allen biopic when? That's it.
Who's Gigi Allen?
Okay. All right. Well, don't worry about it, Chris. You don't want to know.
Okay, cool. Well, all I'm going to say is I'm starting to notice a lot more TV shows, like Hulu is doing Sex Pistols, Tommy. I think that you're going to start seeing the streaming services once again co-opting a good trend, and you're going to probably start seeing mini-series and TV series about these people. I agree with you, Bill, that I think we haven't even hit, we really haven't gotten hard into the 80s new wave scene. I don't think we've dealt with bands like U2 or the Talking Heads or some of the bigger metal bands that I'm drawing a blank on, or the Brit pop. I think people want to see the story of Morrissey. I think they really, really do.
They're never going to make it now. He went full Rush Limbaugh.
But my point is, and I did look it up.
I still love him.
Just to give you guys an idea of what is actually slated to come out in the next year or two is Whitney Houston, Boy George, Marianne Faithfull. Madonna is directing a movie about Madonna. They're doing another Peggy Lee film. And get this, and I'm not joking, it's already been filmed. So it's coming out. Get this, Lemmy. They're doing a Lemmy biography movie. From Motorhead, Ace of Spades. I mean, that's insane. There's people going, who's Lemmy? Google. Better yet, listen. But so I do feel like, just like superhero movies and Star Wars movies, this is just, wow, my hands disappeared. This is really where it's at. And I guess in the end of the day, as long as you guys boomers and our Gen X people and the older millennials are in control of filmmaking, I would argue, and they come out, this is probably what we're going to go see. What do you guys think?
Yeah, like I said, I think we got 10 more years of music for me, and then I'm out.
Bill's right. Like the high point of music was like 75 or something, and band-based music, like live musicians actually play instruments. That kind of music is like it's almost dead.
Yeah. So, guys, I want to thank Bill for coming here and sharing some of that Hollywood.
Thanks
magic.
for having me. It was a lot of fun.
And in the immortal words of Neil Young, better to burn out than to fade away. So on that note, I'm Chris.
Randall.
Bill.
And that's Bill. And Randall and I will talk later, and maybe we'll see Bill again. All right. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye.